Good morning, delegates. Excellent. Thank you, Anna, for warming everybody up for me. Thank you all for coming here today, and I really want to thank all of our hardworking staff who have really made this possible for us today. So can I get a round of applause for those folks, please? I want to take just a moment to introduce some of our very honored guests who are sitting in front of me here in the front row. So starting from my right, there's no political connotation to that, but from my right, Pierre Choinière-Lapointe, who is the National Secretary-Treasurer. Honorary Life Member, and no stranger to anyone in this room, Gwynnie Farrell. The Vice President of our National Union for Region 3, the Prairies, Kim Wilson. Honorary Life Member, Robbie Bowden. Honorary Life Member of MoveUP and President Emeritus of the National Union, Jerry New. And Andy Ross, Honorary Life Member and former President of Local 378. Now, it's my great honor and privilege to welcome all of you here today. To start off, I really want to thank Lori Mayhew for stepping in this morning and doing acknowledgement, I think a very meaningful acknowledgement around work that she has done with herself to learn more about what is needed in terms of truth and reconciliation. And I know I feel a lot of pressure when I'm doing those things because you don't want to make a mistake. And I thought Lori did a fantastic job. So can we have a hand for her, please? We are, of course, gathered on the unsurrendered land. This is the ancestral and traditional land and territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam First Nations. Where we are right now would have been, and if we're being truthful, still is, land belonging to these three nations whose territories cover Vancouver and the surrounding areas, including Richmond, North Vancouver, South Vancouver, Burrard Inlet, in New Westminster, where I reside, and in Burnaby, which is where our MoveUP head office is located. As I began preparing for this year's address, I took the time to look back 3 years at the address that I made 3 years ago here. And one thing that stood out for me is it did not include a land acknowledgement. I recognize that we did have a traditional welcome, as Lori said, just as we were hoping to do this time, but it still stands out for me because over the last 3 years, it is something that we've become much more accustomed to when we gather. Not just in large meetings like this, but in fact in small meetings as well. It's a practice that grew out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action that was released back in 2015. Even though it's only really been in the last few years, we've really seen people make a conscientious effort to make a land acknowledgement. Some people have asked the question, is that real or is it really just performative? How are we really advancing reconciliation just by simply acknowledging we continue to live, mostly, on lands which were simply taken and in most cases never formally ceded? Does simply stating something before every meeting or changing an email signature or putting something up on social media, does that really solve anything? And I think those opinions are certainly valid. But at the same time, when I look back to 3 years ago, when few, if any of us, were having these conversations, I recognize this as progress, however slow that progress is. Certainly, over the last few months, as the horrific nature of the Indian residential school system has been brought back into the spotlight with the confirmations of thousands of unmarked graves and the remains of children. We are still in the midst of this very sad, very ugly part of this country's history. When the news first broke of the remains of the 215 children who were found at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School by the Tecumseh Secwepemc First Nations in late May, Most, in fact, almost all Canadians reacted with horror, and it made front page news across the country and, in fact, internationally. And yet since then, more and more First Nations communities have confirmed more and more unmarked graves. As of September, over 1,300 unmarked graves had been confirmed in Canada. But the Kabaawak First Nation in Quebec has tracked over 6,500 to date. And we can see it's moved out of the public consciousness and the reaction has become more subdued. But we can't forget that every single one of those numbers was a child who was supposed to be going to school and never came home. Children no different from the ones that many of us here will go home to after this convention. And sadly, it's not going to stop at that number. Murray Sinclair, the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, estimates that there could be around 25,000 children who died at those schools. Just because it's no longer front page news doesn't mean it's any less tragic or less horrific. As we do these territorial acknowledgements in whatever meeting you may be at, I hope you use that opportunity to think about the ways that we can push for truth and reconciliation and support Indigenous rights. And that includes how we will support Indigenous communities that went through and are still going through these tragedies, and what we can do to make sure that never happens again. We certainly know that there are many more ongoing issues than just the horrific legacy of the Indian residential school systems that Indigenous communities and people continue to deal with today. Among those issues are access to support services and education for children. And we are very fortunate that we'll be able to hear later this morning from Dr. Cindy Blackstock, who is a renowned champion of Indigenous children's rights. In one respect, having returned now, jumping in my speech. First, I want to acknowledge and thank all of our members, all of you, this is important actually, who have entrusted me for another 3-year term in leading our union. Geez, if I'd missed that line, I wouldn't have got the applause. I've now been in this particular position as president for over 10 years. And I can tell you it's a very rewarding role, but also one that carries a great deal of responsibility. In one respect, having been returned to this role now in successive elections, I take that as an endorsement from our membership of my leadership over this past decade. But I also recognize that just because our members are bringing me back to this position, it doesn't mean that they don't expect change, that they don't expect progress, or that they don't expect transformation. Our union is not the same as it was 10 years ago when I first became president. It's not even the same 3 years ago when I stood in this very spot giving this speech, thanking everyone for re-electing me. Ability and willingness to adapt and change, to open our minds to new possibilities and ideas, is critical to our success and our survival. Inclusion, involvement, and capacity are critical to our success and our survival. The theme of the convention, as you can see, is breaking barriers, embracing diversity. I want to address what that means for us, for our members, and for our union. And I fully recognize that as doing so, I am, in many ways, the very symbol of that privilege that we're talking about. I am a cis white male in the position of leader in this organization. As with any elected leader, there are many who feel that I'm ideally suited for this job, but I know I've got my share of detractors as well. But what I can say is that for those who are in the latter category, those who don't think I'm doing a good job or don't want me to be successful, their reasons for feeling that way about me are not related to the color of my skin, to my gender, or to my apparent sexual orientation. This is the privilege that I recognize that I enjoy. And I know the privilege that many others, including many in this room and some on this stage, are denied. But while I do have this privilege, I ask for your indulgence for just a moment while I share a personal story of mine. As some of you know, but others may not, I am a childhood cancer survivor. I had a very rare form of cancer that resulted in the loss of my eye at a very young age. And because of that, growing up, I was different. And for that, I was teased. And even into adulthood and professional life, I've been subjected to jokes ranging from friendly joshing around to actually some hateful name-calling. I'm not sharing this story to try and elicit sympathy from folks here, although at this point I'm going to look at Anna Mohammed and remind folks we do have a bullying and harassment policy. That stuff is never okay. But despite this, I have never seen this as a limitation or considered it to be a disability. And part of that is actually the problem. I have grown to live with it and adapt. And because of that, most folks around me no longer see this as a disability issue, even though that it really is. I've been reminded of this in the past as well. I remember once being denied a rental vehicle while traveling in the UK because they wouldn't rent it to somebody who had one eye. I remember to this day how that made me feel. My point in telling this story is that even those of us who happen to be affected can sometimes find it hard to identify, especially when we fear that we might be ostracized for it. Now, despite that, I enjoy a great deal of privilege, and this doesn't take away from that privilege that I enjoy. But now put yourself in the shoes of someone who enjoys far less privilege. Put yourself in the shoes of a woman. Put yourself in the shoes of someone who is Indigenous, someone who is Black, someone who is Asian, someone who is gay, lesbian, bisexual, or queer, someone who is transgender. What are we doing to ensure they are included? What are we doing to ensure that they can get involved in a way that is meaningful and in a way that makes them feel safe? What are we doing to ensure we have the capacity to do all the things we say that we want to do? Are we recognizing how our actions or our inactions affect them? When we talk about embracing diversity, it's not just to say we tolerate them as long as they conform to how we feel they should act or behave. Nor can we engage in behavior that attempts to continue to marginalize or downgrade or degrade their message in favor of the folks who already enjoy privilege. I want to share a very real example with all of you from our union and how this plays out. As hopefully everyone here is aware, we have a Human Rights and Multicultural Committee that often engages our membership by telling them about upcoming festivities or observances from cultures that are not the predominant ones in our society. We have spotlighted events such as the Lunar New Year, the Mid-Autumn Festival, Baisakhi, Ramadan, and so on. When these emails go out, we get the odd positive response from people who are grateful that we're sharing this information about their culture. But the ones that always strike me are the ones that come back to us and ask, why are we promoting them? Or we'll say things such as, you better do something about the Christian holidays like Christmas and Easter. Like we don't. Even though our community, among our own peers, we see a failure to recognize that privilege exists. We cannot turn a blind eye to it or write it off, especially if it's from our friend or our colleague. To embrace diversity also means embracing the role we have, especially those of us who enjoy privilege, to stand up and fight for those who enjoy less privilege. It is to say that we are here to help, to lend a voice to those whose voices have been stifled or silenced in the past. It is at that point when we can begin to slowly break barriers and recognize there are more barriers to break. Barriers that we don't even know exist right now. Or barriers that, because of our privilege, we fail to recognize or see. 10 years ago, would someone who's not part of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community march in a pride parade or wear a shirt that proudly proclaims supporting their rights? Today, we know that's not enough, but it is a barrier broken. There was a time when those in the labor movement would never have even conceived of supporting, let alone being the main thrust behind, campaigns that called for the ending of the discriminatory blood ban against men who have sex with men, or ending period poverty, or supporting leave for domestic violence workers, or the rights of sex workers. Unions are recognizing that building worker solidarity and strength cannot be just in the vacuum of the workplace, and it's not just about negotiating new deals. We have an obligation to build a just society for our members, a progressive society, and that is why the work we do must extend beyond the workplace and into the world of social justice and politics. That is what we mean when we say workers' voices need to be heard. They need to be heard in all those spheres because ultimately they are all interconnected. That is the big picture. And it all sounds great, but what are we really doing to make sure that it gets done? When I look back at the example of our Human Rights and Multicultural Committee, and many of the cultural observances that people wonder why we don't promote over the ones that we do, it comes back to our core concerns: inclusion, involvement, capacity. Have we done the work to encourage more members from diverse backgrounds to seek out our Human Rights and Multicultural Committee? Have we created a space that encourages them to get involved and share their ideas? Have we built enough capacity, not only in terms of committee members, but within our own structures so that we can make those activities possible? This is just one committee's work, but it can't be just one committee's work. It has to be the work of our whole union. Over these next 3 days, we'll be examining all aspects of our union and the work we do, ranging from our workplaces to the public sphere. And I want everybody to keep these 3 words in mind as we continue on: inclusion, involvement, and capacity. If you look back on some of the defining moments of the last 3 years for our union, I would say we had a few events that really stood out. The strike at Westminster Savings Credit Union. It lasted about 9 months in 2019 and was a major defining event for our union. This was a fight that at the outset, few of us imagined it would go the way it did or last as long as it did. The fight started over a change in the pension plan. The employer wanted to take it away and replace it with a much inferior plan. But it went on to become much more than that. This was a bargaining unit with just 8 people. 8 people in a single, lonely branch going up against a juggernaut employer with resources well beyond those of our own. Now, legally, I'm limited to what I can tell you about the settlement, but what I can tell you is that our members who were on that picket line for 9 months all ended up in a better position than where that dispute began. And at the core of our work, that's what we're all about. We want our members to be better off. But this campaign, this fight, had benefits beyond just the 8 people in that bargaining unit. This was a fight that sent a signal to our employers, especially in that industry, that MoveUP is not going to back down for a fight, that we are willing to invest the resource in our members and fight with them. About a year or so after this labor dispute came to an end, we found ourselves engaged in difficult negotiations at a couple other credit unions, specifically Vantage One Credit Union and Coastal Community Credit Union. In both those cases, our members gave us a strike vote. In talking to our negotiating reps after a deal was reached at both credit unions, they pointed out specifically that the credit union sector had been watching what had happened at Westminster Savings, and they knew that if they tried to force the issue against our members at either of those credit unions, they were going to be in for an incredibly rough ride. And our reps truly felt that what helped to get a deal, obviously the members at those two credit unions, but what helped to get a deal at Vantage One and Coastal Community, we also recently organized 2 more branches of Vantage One into our union. That doesn't happen without our members being involved and showing solidarity at the Vantage One picket line, which was fueled by the solidarity which was shown a year prior on the Westminster Savings picket line. But why did our campaign manage to be a success despite the loss of that branch? Inclusion. Because they felt included. They were motivated to be involved. This was an incredibly tight-knit group that looked out for one another. And we had some very dedicated picket captains that made sure people were taken care of, that kept the door open for members to get involved without losing faith and not for a short period of time. But it wasn't just the 8 people and a handful of staff who were involved. Because we created an inclusive space, a safe space for supporters, we attracted involvement across many sectors. We had different MoveUP members from other units drop by. Somebody's up here, right? There he is. We had members of other unions come by, not just their leaders, but rank and file members as well. We had business leaders come by. We had local politicians come by, many times actually. We even had a rally where members of a union from Hawaii came and joined and marched with us and spoke at our rally. When we open the doors to inclusion and involvement, that's when we have the capacity to do more than we ever expected. Because we understood this was about more than just 8 people. This was more than just about a pension plan. And because we were willing to make that investment, our capacity to do things increased exponentially. We could go out and leaflet at parades. We could go and hold telephone town hall meetings with the local community. We could encourage donations from our national union, from members across the country, many of whom might never have heard of Westminster Savings or knew where Port Coquitlam was on a map. But they were willing to support because we opened the doors to inclusion and involvement, even from afar. The second major campaign that we undertook during this term was our Driving Public campaign to support fixing public car insurance. And again, it was once again our ability to include and involve that drove that capacity. We can run so many ads on digital and social and television, but if we don't get people feeling like they are included and have a pathway to involvement, we cannot do the things that we do or have the impact that we have had. And our campaign success had a lot to do with people, particularly from the ICBC unit, who saw that this was a space they were included in and they were respected in. They saw this was a campaign where we were fighting not only to protect their jobs and their industry, not only for the health of our union, but because it was in the best interest of all British Columbians. And in response, our members volunteered to go and spread the message, whether it was at trade shows other conventions, or talking to their local politicians. Every bit of that helped our capacity to be able to run this campaign. But I am not going to sugarcoat it. Quite frankly, that was a fight where if we didn't win, our union would look very different today. This room, for instance, would be about half full, because all of us here from ICBC would not be here today. We fought and we won, but we can't forget why we managed to win. Inclusion, involvement, and capacity. The third major campaign came earlier just this year, when our members at Kelowna Cabs were involved in a 4-month lockout. In the end, we came out on top. Our members returned to work, won a fair collective agreement that specifically protected their jobs, and they also received a signing bonus. But this was no easy fight, and I think there were even times that our reps wondered if we would come out intact. And the reason why there was this struggle was, again, related to inclusion, involvement, and capacity, or rather, the lack thereof. This was a bargaining unit that had been whittled down significantly by the employer over time. We had 2 very dedicated members, and one's in here somewhere, who spent 4 months talking to reporters during the pandemic, handing out leaflets, writing op-eds in local papers, during the pandemic. This was during the pandemic. But we had just as many in that bargaining unit that were uninvolved and uninterested in the labor dispute. And as we assess why we had challenges, we have to ask ourselves, did we create an inclusive space? And if not, why not? Because inclusion feeds involvement, and involvement feeds capacity. And why are these fights important? Because they set a tone, and they get noticed. In late July, our union announced that workers at Surrey Metro Taxi voted to join MoveUP. The applause is great, absolutely. Now you could say it's a coincidence that just after the Kelowna Cabs dispute that we signed up another taxi unit, but you also cannot ignore the fact that for 4 months, and credit to our communications department, we dominated news headlines when it came to this topic in this industry. When it came to written stories in local papers or interviews on TV cameras, it was always the story of MoveUP, standing up for its members and protecting their jobs in the taxi industry. And if you look at it through that lens, that is another way for our union to demonstrate that, yes, we are here to create an inclusive space for people working in this industry. We're here to create a space for you to get involved. Now, I just want to add one more success story that we've experienced recently, and that was with the expansion of our bargaining unit at TST CF Express, formerly known as Canadian Freightways. For months and months, our organizers and reps ran a very difficult campaign, which really played out like a poker hand, where you had to go all in. We were dealing with a situation where we had the potential to expand our bargaining unit quite a bit. But at the same time, we had to risk that we could lose everything and all the members that we already had. We couldn't try and just keep the status quo, because we knew from the past experience with this employer that if we had tried just to keep the members we had, eventually they'd be successful at transferring all the work out of that bargaining unit. So we had to run this campaign. But the employer wasn't about to hand out the names and contacts of all their non-union employees and say, here you go ahead and contact these folks. Now, our rep particularly had a very good relationship with the existing members at TSTCF. And from that, our organizers really had to work again on inclusion, involvement, and ultimately, capacity. This campaign was won, really, by our members who gave us the capacity to do more than we could at the outset. Because at the outset, we had nothing. No contact information, no knowledge about working conditions among the non-union workers, not even necessarily where they worked. But our organizers created a place where members felt included. They reached out to them as a group and individually. We held Zoom meetings, telephone town hall meetings, and through that, we got those members to get involved. Now they were the ones who were helping us to build that capacity, being our eyes and ears, and talking to the others that they knew. And ultimately, it was the members who won this vote for us, by talking to enough of the non-union workers to swing that vote. We also have to give a big shout out to our comrades and friends from COPE in Ontario and Quebec. Pierrick is here today, and the organizers in Quebec were a huge assistance for our organizers here in BC, again, during a pandemic. So please give Pierrick a round of applause for that. Without their help, especially doing a lot of the groundwork in a time when we couldn't travel, and providing assistance with French language support, we would not have been able to accomplish what we did. That relationship is important, as are the relationships we have with the rest of the labor movement. The support that we get, the support that we give, and the shared resource is so valuable for all of us. Our work needs to be continued. We need them to feel included, especially the ones at Canadian Freightways who did not vote for us, because they're the ones who felt they weren't being included. So we need them to feel included. We need them to be involved. And in order to do that, we have to rely on our members, our activists, the people in this room, to help us be that capacity. All of us lead very busy lives, whether that's our work lives or our personal lives. But we are union activists because we believe in the work of unions. We believe in the work of the labor movement. We believe that not only can we make our own lives better, but that we're working to help make the lives of those around us better as well. Over the next 3 days, we will be discussing a lot of policy, and we'll be making a lot of decisions that will set the direction of our union. And as you are listening to the debates, as you're considering all of the resolutions, I want you to keep these stories about our campaigns in mind. And I want you to write these 3 words down if you've got your pen from the front. Inclusion, involvement, capacity. With everything that we do, or say that we want to do, are we meeting our goals of ensuring each of these things can happen? We can start right now by just looking around this room or looking up at the stage and ask questions like, who are we missing? Why are we missing them? Who should be here that isn't? What barriers do we need to break down to inclusion so people will feel welcome? What do we have to do to get greater involvement from our members? What needs to change so that our union can have the tools to create more capacity? What old practices or old ways of thinking do we have to break out of in order to make these things possible? How do we make people understand the strength of this union lies in making sure we have inclusion, involvement, and capacity across all of our units, and that we aren't as individuals limited to our thinking about what's best for ICBC or what's best at Community Savings or what's best at BC Hydro, what's best at Berlitz or what's best at Kelowna Cabs, but we're thinking about the whole union. Everybody here should also recognize that even though you may be one voice, that voice is important, and that voice will be heard. One voice can make a difference. One voice can affect change. When we think about great activists, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Viola Desmond, Autumn Peltier, Greta Thunberg, Jack Layton. We sometimes forget they are one voice too. Now, because I'm the president and this is my speech, I'm going to give you one more story. This is the moment that I think of as being my aha moment, but also one where I remember realizing the incredible power that just one voice has. I was at an NDP convention in the early 1990s, just up the road there at the Hotel Vancouver, where I'd just been elected as part of a slate. It wasn't the official slate. We young people going against the man, and we managed to win. But one of our main things was we were fighting against the resumption of post-secondary tuition fee increases. They'd been huge under the social credit government. The NDP stopped it for 1 year, and then they were going to start doing tuition fee increases again. We had an NDP government in power for the first time after, coincidentally, 16 years at that point as well. And we had just managed at that convention to successfully organize against the government. So it was us against the government, that was very clear. And we were celebrating. We had beat the man. We had beat the Premier and the ministers of the Crown. When the Premier's chief of staff, someone whom I'd never met, but I certainly know who he was, pulled me aside and said he wanted to meet with me in private. I was like, oh God, I'm getting called to the principal's office here. He took me out of the convention hall and said, congratulations, good job. You guys did a really good job on that floor organizing, great work. And he said, but now you've given us a problem. Post-secondary education needs funding, and the government doesn't have it. What would students accept for a tuition fee increase? What would you accept as a reasonable tuition fee increase? At the time, UBC, where I was a student, had been talking about an 18% tuition fee increase. And here I was, just one kid, a university kid, wasn't even part of the student government, and I was thinking, I don't have the authority to negotiate this. Why is the chief of the staff to the Premier asking me what I thought tuition fees should be in British Columbia? But he wouldn't let it go. And I remember eventually just blurting out to him, well, it can't be double digits. A couple months later, the Premier did a press conference on television and said they were limiting tuition fee increases in British Columbia to less than 10%. And I watched that, and I holy shit. Sorry. That was the moment when I saw activism really make change, and that there are consequences to that activism, because people in power are going to come and get you and come and talk to you and listen to you. And at that moment, that's when you realize the power of organizing, the power of your voice when you are an activist. And don't discount the power of one voice. How many times have we heard, a lot of times when we deal especially with a union-busting employer, that suddenly when they want to make something happen, they go to the workers and they try to play nice. It's not an accident. It's because they know the power that workers hold. They know that the power that even convincing one person has, because of the power of that voice to spread a message. And I would be remiss, speaking of politics, if I don't also address the importance of having our members, our activists in this room especially, help foster an inclusive space for activists to get involved in the political sphere as well. One of the things members, those who aren't as aware of what we do, tend to ask a lot about is why we care about politics so much. Why are we endorsing candidates and parties? Why are we telling them who to vote for? We don't actually tell them who to vote for, but they think we're telling them who to vote for. Well, it's an overly simplistic answer, but politics and political direction shape our ability to help our members, to affect positive change in society, not only on the social justice front, but in the very industries that are critical to our members and their families. We focus on all levels of politics, but especially so municipally and provincially, because that's where the decisions are made that affect our members the most. The very first convention that we had was back in 2007. I still have the t-shirt. Our last convention was in 2018. That was the first time we ever had the sitting Premier of British Columbia speak to our delegates here. That's not to say that we had not had NDP leaders speak to us in the past. We certainly did. But it wasn't until 2018 that they had done so as Premier. And I can tell you, looking at Jerry and Andy, that in the 16 years from 2001 to 2017 that we had the BC Liberals in power in BC, and I was around those years, a couple of them as president, a few of them as president. I was vice president for some of them and various other roles before that. We met with the BC Premier once. One time in 16 years. Since the 3 years that the NDP have been in government now, we've finally had a voice and an ability to engage. With this government, myself and Annette Toth, the VP for ICBC, met many times with Attorney General David Eby when ICBC was in his portfolio. With Vice President Risa Cronenbusch, we've had lots of opportunities to talk with ministers about who had energy-related issues in their portfolio. With combined units, Vice President Christy Slusarenko, we've met with Ministers Ann Kang and Melanie Mark when they were the post-secondary education ministers, and with Ministers of Transportation Fleming and Trevina before him, to talk about public transit issues. More than just having an audience, we have a seat at important tables. I am on the province's Climate Solutions Leadership Council. Our former Vice President, Gwynnie Farrell, just finished a huge review of BC Hydro. Our former president, Andy Ross, sits on the TransLink board and the BC Ferries board. We had nothing like that with the Liberals. I remember having a meeting not too long ago with a long-time high-level civil servant, and he told me that under the BC Liberals, they were discouraged to engage with Labour. Not only were they to be pro-business, they weren't even to talk to unions. People don't remember that, but now that's changed. There will absolutely be times where we don't always agree with what they decide. Sometimes there will be times where we do agree with what they've done. We've certainly seen that, especially so over these last few years, with things such as fixing ICBC, or putting money into transit to avoid massive layoffs when the pandemic first hit. But also, from a general labor perspective, like bringing in paid leave for domestic violence survivors. And now, on the cusp of bringing in permanent paid sick leave for all British Columbians. Preach! Other unions, like the Hospital Employees Union, for instance, saw this BC NDP government finally reverse the damage the BC Liberals did almost 2 decades ago when they laid off all those hospital support workers and privatized their work, leading to lower wages, worse services, and unfortunately, as we learned recently, preventable deaths. Shame. Those damaging changes are being reversed by this government in the long-term care sector. Are there other things that we want them to do that they haven't? You betcha. But that's why we're here, to push for those things that will help our members and our communities. We're just coming off a federal election now. Next year, we're going to have municipal elections in BC, something I know Andy Ross is very acutely aware of. And in 2024, or possibly even sooner, we'll be right back in a provincial election period. We need you. We need you to be active and to help us build that inclusive space where members feel comfortable getting involved in our political activities. Why are we all gathered here over the next 3 days? Our purpose is to set the direction for our union. To do that, we must examine where we have been and where we need to go. Change can be difficult. But without a constant eye toward progress, we risk falling behind very quickly. I think many of us learned, I certainly did, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, just how quickly sometimes change can happen, and how adaptive we all are and can be when the situation calls for it. Things that we thought never could have been done. I certainly was very skeptical, like working remotely on a regular basis, relying on tools like Zoom or different forms of instant messaging to communicate with our colleagues, or getting everyone to follow safety protocols and being respectful, like wearing masks. That never crossed our minds, and yet here we are. Well, most of us are being respectful of these things. We have adapted. We also learned that supporting our members also meant standing up for them when their communities were coming under attack, particularly among our members who identify as Asian, when they were, and sadly continue to be, attacked, both emotionally and physically. But also members in the Black community, members of the Muslim community, members of the Indigenous community, members of the transgender community, members of the gay, lesbian, bisexual, and queer community, and many others. At convention, we are here to hear from you. You are the voice of our members in their workplaces. But those of you gathered here also represent the most engaged activists in our union. We need more members like you, and we need your help to bring them in. And we need your voices, because you all bring a diversity of opinions from your different backgrounds. Not just your different work backgrounds, but your different personal backgrounds as well. Now, my role as president is not to unilaterally decide on the direction of this union. That's up to you. That's up to all of us, the members. My role is to execute the will of our members in the best way possible. But my responsibility also is to use my leadership, my expertise, my knowledge, and my understanding, and guide our members into making the decisions that will benefit our union, and all our members, both now and in the long term. And this is what I believe. I believe that change is not only needed, it is demanded. It is necessary. Silence is no longer an option. Following the old path is no longer acceptable. As a union, we must be a leader of change. If we truly value the voices of our members and believe that the diversity of these voices gives us strength, we must embrace these voices and push for these voices to guide our change. We must embrace diversity and take actions that shatter our preconceived notions, no matter how uncomfortable that makes us. We must break through the barriers that we acknowledge that we have had a hand in building and reinforcing. It is only then that we can make positive progress for our members, for our communities, and for ourselves. I'm sure all of you were paying attention when we started the convention off with the introduction video that served as the build for our logo. I encourage you to look at it again closely, and we'll put it up on social media later, and examine the symbolism. Many of you were in this room in 2018 will note that the video actually begins with the 2018 logo itself, and elements of it are from that 2018 logo. But since then, we have transformed. Our members have transformed. Recent events in our world have made embracing diversity more important now than ever. The landscape has shifted. It's been shaken to its core. We must not be afraid to break what we have built before in order for us to build more, to progress, to advance, to move up. In fact, what we've built before must be broken in order for us to build more, to advance, to move up. These next 3 days we will work toward a common purpose of strengthening our union. Our goal will always be to make sure that each and every one of our 12,000 plus members feels heard, feels represented, and feels connected. We need them to know that there are people who are working hard to make this union better and to make their situations better. In other words, included, involved, and have capacity. Elected officials, our staff, all of you, we are all here to do everything we can to advance our union, to advance the causes that our members tell us are important, and to make tomorrow better than today. It's your time now. It's our time. These next 3 days, we need you to take our union in a direction where more people feel included, where more people feel empowered to get involved, where all of us can contribute to increase capacity so that we can do the important things like ensuring equity, advancing member education and activism, and making sure that no members get left behind. Now let's get to work, everybody. Thank you very much.